Some investigations begin with a witness. Others begin with a confession. This one began with silence. Wichita, Kansas, the 1970s. A series of violent crimes left investigators facing a difficult reality. The offender planned carefully. Evidence was limited. Witnesses could describe fragments, not a face, not a name. Years passed. The crimes stopped. The investigation did not. Boxes of evidence filled police storage rooms. Photographs, reports, maps, thousands of pages documenting every lead. The question remained unchanged. Who was responsible? For decades, no one could answer it. This is not the story of one offender. It is the story of an investigation that refused to end. Welcome to Last Known. Every investigation has momentum. Then comes the moment when momentum disappears. Witnesses move away. Memories fade. Physical evidence ages. Public attention shifts elsewhere. For many cases, that is where the story ends. For this one, it was only the beginning. Detectives reviewed every report. Crime scenes were compared. Behavioral patterns were studied. Investigators believed the same individual was responsible for multiple attacks across the Wichita area. The offender appeared organized, patient, methodical. There was no obvious pattern in daily routines, no simple suspect. Every promising lead eventually collapsed under scrutiny. The case entered what investigators call a cold phase. Cold did not mean forgotten. It meant there were no new answers. New detectives inherited the investigation. Each generation started with the same question. What did the previous generation miss? Every file was read again. Every photograph examined again. Every interview reconsidered. Sometimes a fresh perspective finds what experience cannot. Sometimes it doesn't. Years continued to pass. The evidence waited. Technology changes. Evidence does not. That became the defining lesson of the investigation. When many of the crimes were first investigated, forensic science had significant limitations. Investigators collected what they could. Some evidence could not yet be fully analyzed. Instead of discarding it, they preserved it. That decision would prove critical. As DNA analysis improved during the following decades, older evidence gained new value. Items once considered inconclusive became scientifically meaningful. Laboratories revisited preserved samples using techniques unavailable when the crimes first occurred. The investigation slowly shifted, not because the evidence had changed, because science had. Still, a DNA profile alone could not identify a person unless there was something to compare it against. Investigators had evidence. They still lacked identity. The case remained open. The wait continued. Then something unexpected happened. After years of silence, new communications connected to the case began reaching media organizations and investigators. Every letter, every package, every digital item, everything was treated as evidence. Nothing was considered routine. Investigators understood that modern forensic science extended far beyond fingerprints and DNA. Paper carried traces. Ink carried clues. Computers stored information users rarely noticed. Even digital files could reveal hidden details. The investigation entered a new phase, not driven by eyewitnesses, driven by forensic examination. Each communication was processed carefully. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was assumed. One digital storage device attracted particular attention. At first glance, it appeared ordinary. The forensic examination suggested otherwise. Metadata embedded within the file offered investigators a direction they had never possessed before. Not a complete answer, a starting point. Sometimes that is all an investigation needs. For the first time in decades, the investigation was no longer expanding. It was narrowing. One lead, one location, one name beginning to emerge. Investigators follow that lead through digital forensics, DNA analysis, and surveillance, steps that ultimately brought one of America's longest-running investigations to its conclusion. For decades, investigators had searched outward. Now, for the first time, the investigation began moving inward, toward a specific lead, toward a specific location, toward a specific person. The breakthrough came from digital forensics. Information hidden within electronic files pointed investigators toward a computer associated with a church in Wichita, Kansas. The church itself was not evidence. It was a connection, a place, a starting point. Detectives began examining individuals connected to that location. Records were reviewed, employment histories were checked, timelines were compared. One name began appearing repeatedly. Dennis Rader. Investigators approached the lead cautiously. Cold cases have a way of creating false hope. A promising suspect means nothing without evidence. The goal was not to build a theory. The goal was to test one. Surveillance began. Investigators observed routines, movements, habits. Nothing dramatic, nothing rushed. Patience had carried the investigation this far. Patience would carry it further, but observation alone would never be enough. The investigation required something stronger, something measurable, something scientific. It required DNA. DNA had transformed criminal investigations, but DNA is only useful when comparisons are possible. Investigators needed to determine whether the suspect was connected to the biological evidence preserved for decades. A direct sample was not immediately available. Instead, investigators pursued a lawful comparison using a medical sample associated with a close family member. The objective was simple: determine whether a biological relationship existed between the unknown DNA profile and the suspect's family. Laboratory analysis followed. Technicians examined genetic markers. Profiles were compared. The results narrowed the possibilities dramatically. The evidence indicated a close biological connection. Further testing strengthened the conclusion. Independent pieces of evidence began aligning. Digital evidence, historical timelines, behavioral analysis, DNA. Separately, each piece carried weight. Together, they formed a compelling picture. The investigation that had once stretched across decades and thousands of leads now focused on a single individual. For detectives who had spent years on the case, the moment was significant, not because the investigation was over, because they finally knew where it was leading. The next step would be the most visible: an arrest. February 25, 2005. Park City, Kansas. Law enforcement officers moved into position. The operation was carefully planned. Years of investigative work had led to this moment. There would be no dramatic pursuit, no public confrontation, just procedure. The suspect was taken into custody. The arrest marked the end of one chapter, the beginning of another. Search warrants followed. Investigators collected computers, documents, storage media, personal records. Every item was cataloged and examined. Evidence gathered across decades was now being reviewed alongside newly obtained materials. The legal process moved forward. Court proceedings would ultimately determine accountability. For the public, the arrest seemed sudden. For investigators, it was the result of years of work, years of preserving evidence, years of following leads, years of refusing to close the file. The courtroom provided something the investigation could not: a public record, a formal accounting of events. Victims' families attended proceedings. Survivors listened. Investigators watched the final stage of a case many believed might never be solved. The legal process focused on evidence, documents, forensic results, historical records. The case demonstrated how old evidence could remain relevant long after a crime occurred. Technology had evolved. The evidence had remained. That combination changed everything. For many families, the proceedings brought answers, not all answers, but some. Questions that had existed for decades finally received official responses. The investigation had reached its conclusion. The impact would continue much longer. The courtroom provided something the investigation could not: a public record, a formal accounting of events. Victims' families attended proceedings. Survivors listened. Investigators watched the final stage of a case many believed might never be solved. The legal process focused on evidence, documents, forensic results, historical records. The case demonstrated how old evidence could remain relevant long after a crime occurred. Technology had evolved. The evidence had remained. That combination changed everything. For many families, the proceedings brought answers, not all answers, but some. Questions that had existed for decades finally received official responses. The investigation had reached its conclusion. The impact would continue much longer.